Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome this opportunity to speak to Bill C-4, an act to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, and the Marine Transportation Security Act. I've listened to the debate on C-4 with great interest. The Conservatives claim that this bill will crack down on human smugglers. Unfortunately, C-4 will not do anything to deter human smugglers. Instead, it will unfairly target legitimate refugees desperately seeking asylum. The true Conservative agenda to crassly capitalize on the worst stereotypes related to immigrants and refugees through this bill has been constantly displayed in this debate. Before this House is a bill that fails to achieve its intended goal of stopping human smuggling. It will, however, succeed in violating international law and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Audrey McLaughlin, professor of the Faculty of Law School and Centre for Ethics at the University of Toronto, and Sean Rehag, professor of York University, Osgood Law School, and Centre for Refugee Studies, have said that provisions like the ones in this bill, and I quote, flagrantly violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Canada's international legal obligations. It is inconceivable that the government was not advised that key elements were unlawful. It is more likely that the government did not care. End of quote. The Conservative government claims that C-4 will entrust the Minister of Public Safety with the power to designate the arrival of a group of individuals as a human smuggling event if the manner in which they enter the country is deemed contrary to Canada's immigration laws. However, nothing in this legislation actually addresses a human smuggling event. Instead, the legislation deals with the designation of an irregular arrival. Under this particular designation, all groups of 2 or more people could be designated under either of the 2 very broad criteria, which could in fact apply to the vast majority of refugee claimants. Under the provisions of C-4, individuals arbitrarily designated by the Minister of Public Safety would be prevented from appealing to the new Refugee Appeal Division that was agreed to last spring. This process enabled all refugee claimants the opportunity to appeal for status. Furthermore, legitimate refugees traveling aboard a vessel that is arbitrarily designated by the government as an irregular arrival will be prohibited from applying for other forms of residence, such as those on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, for 5 years. This measure unfairly and punitively punishes the victim. If the refugee is legitimate, Canada has an international obligation to protect. Right. But this legislation unfairly targets legitimate refugees through its punitive and broad punishment in an effort to keep legitimate refugees from obtaining residence and protection, all because of the manner in which they arrived. How does this government expect refugees who have suffered persecution and risked their lives to get to Canada? Not everyone can travel like the Minister of Defence on Challenger jets and search and rescue helicopters. Additionally, this legislation allows for an individual who is deemed a legitimate refugee to be shipped back to his or her country of origin 5 years after their refugee status is granted if the government decides they no longer need protection. Not only does this measure violate international law, it is cruel and seeks to disrupt any resemblance of life they may have made in Canada after fleeing persecution and could in fact put them back in danger. The right to assimilation and naturalization are rights that are given to refugees under the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. Article 43 states, and I quote, "The contracting state shall, as far as possible, facilitate the assimilation and naturalization of refugees. They shall in particular make every effort to expedite naturalization proceeds and to reduce as far as possible the charges and costs of such proceedings." End of quote. This bill not only ignores Canada's international obligations to protect legitimate refugees seeking asylum, it seeks to further victimize their already difficult experiences. C-4 will not hold human smugglers responsible for their illegal and heinous abuse of refugees. This draconian and backwards piece of legislation is dangerous and attempts to criminalize the refugee instead of the smuggler. Once again, the blind partnership of the Conservatives is masked in the name of public safety. I would hope that if a bully beat up a victim, this government would have the sense to understand that further punishing the victim would not dissuade the bully from abusing other victims.